For a few moments this evening, we are going to examine the challenge of how each and every one of you sustain your attunement at the level of your Holy Christ Self. I think you could agree with me that this is almost always a very daunting challenge. Some of you might secretly raise your hand and say, sustain it. I'd be happy to just experience it one time. Don't make me laugh. You have more of the Christ consciousness in you than you have ever dreamt. In the pure child within every one of you, that's already an externalized dimension of the Christ self of your being. I'll remind you all that when certain groups of Pharisees came to Jesus, they said, "Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who's the one that is the most exalted?" And he sent for a young adolescent or a young child and held that child up and said, "This is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So you should always appreciate the fact that your own beloved Holy Christ Self is possessed of a spontaneous heart, a childlike innocence and wonder, as well as a great hoary wisdom of the ages, a great dignified being. The Ascended Masters are most concerned that all of you begin to have the reinforcement of the overshadowing of your own Holy Christ Self, so that you will begin to really live the life of your God presence in the person of your Holy Christ Self. They recognize that even this path, with all of its wonders and all of its goodness and all of the assistance that is given to you, that this is not a path for those who are more or less operating independently in their four lower bodies, and for the most part sealed out of the realm in which the Holy Christ Self and the God Presence live. For when you're sealed out, I think you'd agree with me that the best you can do is pull out your cheat sheet of do's and don'ts, the things you're supposed to do and the things you're not supposed to do, and you kind of grit your teeth and say, okay, it says here that this is the way I'm supposed to conduct myself, therefore I will myself into following this series of do's and don'ts. Well, that's no way to live. In fact, it's not really living at all. And it has a half-life, that kind of human willpower, because you only have the amount of light that has been transferred from the inner realms to the outer realms. You've only got what you've got in your four lower bodies. And if that's not renewed by attunement on a regular basis, sooner or later the accumulation in the lower bodies is going to expend itself. And then you'll be like a bleached fish on the bank without any real oomph to pursue the path. That really is no way to live. So the challenge is to keep open the shuttle of the flow of life and of love, going back and forth between the outer chalice of the four lower bodies and this magnificent, enchanted, perfect realm in which your Holy Christ Self lives and moves constantly about. The Masters know that when that doorway into that world is open permanently. It's an entirely different equation because now you have reinforcement. Now you are experiencing, from moment to moment and from day to day, you're experiencing the joy of life that your Holy Christ Self experiences. Before this time, let's look at the typical situation for most outer consciousness of most of the human race. Basically, what you have is a situation of where the crystal cord of, I would say, 90% plus of the human race, maybe 98%. It's hard to say, but most people have the energy of the crystal cord, which is coming from within, entering the heart, being transferred from the crystal cord and distributed to the four lower bodies with a sufficiency of the life force to run those bodies. It's like an electrical current that you turn on when you turn your personal computer on in the morning. It keeps the motors humming, it keeps the phosphors firing, but it's not much more than just the process, the ongoing process of waking, sleeping, eating, of sustaining life in the body with little transcendent consciousness that actually goes on between the outer four lower bodies and the inner God presence. It's no wonder then that individuals who find themselves in this situation kind of revert to making the best of the situation of their life. They kind of resign themselves to feathering the nest in the physical world, being as comfortable as possible, having as many creature comforts, the typical outer world happiness of a career, of having loved ones close at hand, all of those natural, understandable patterns. But there is not really the transcendence that goes on and the ability to identify. So the masters understand that it's not possible to sustain the initiatory path that leads to the ascension in that equation, because even if the individual in that situation finds themselves within a religious framework, it's an outer form that is followed. And here and there may be mountaintop moments of exaltation. There may be moments of feeling the wafting by of the presence of an angel or the presence of an ascended master. Maybe at Christmas time, there's a little extra sense of enchantment that comes over one. But in general, it is a course of just going through the motions of living the outer life. The strategy of the ascended masters for the golden age and for individual ascensions is that there be the closer approach of the overshadowing of each one's own Holy Christ self and the unbroken communion between the heart of the individual in their outer consciousness in their four lower bodies and the heart of the Holy Christ Self in the I Am presence, and that the individual begin to find reinforcement from the presence. Do you know what I mean by that? None of you could possibly ever live your life in a vacuum. You couldn't ever be removed from the stimuli of the five physical senses and of the outer world, but yet not have opened up to you the realm of your Christ self, for there to be a new life and a new consciousness that opens up. Back in the 60s or the 70s, when it was trendy to do these kinds of things, they had those isolation tanks where they tried to deprive people of as much of the five physical senses as possible and make the mind a blank and see what would flash in front of the consciousness at that time. So it's not really possible to sustain the path, the initiatory path, the rigors of the path that leads to the ascension, unless more and more you begin to build upon the living attunement and connection with the God presence. Now, initially, when the heart resonates to the truth of the path, the mind is brought along with the heart flame. And you come into meetings such as this, and you receive an untold blessing. For during the time that the Ascended Masters are overshadowing you and bringing you into their presence, you actually have lent to you the fire of their attainment, which bathes your feeling body, which bathes your mind. And to the degree that each one is able, you see through the eyes of the Ascended Master. You perceive the vistas, the transcendent vistas of God reality that they perceive. And of course, at that mountaintop experience, like St. Peter, we all want to say, let's build our little domicile up here and let's stay in this mountaintop forever. Would that it were possible in that way. The problem is that this is a grace, an encouragement, which is intended to be an initiatory impulse, which is to start the bodies spinning faster and faster, to deposit within your bodies certain nuggets, radioactive nuggets, seeds of God consciousness, which continue to radiate the God consciousness of the Ascended Masters who have shared their life and their attainment with you. And each one of these is intended to be a point of contact preserved within your four lower bodies that you can use as a window into these higher realms. Now, perhaps you haven't understood a couple of the most, I would almost like to use for the purpose of stressing the non-negotiable nature of this principle, the impersonal law, which we refer to as the law of octaves. This law is uncanny in its accuracy and its impersonal action. It is astonishing how from instant to instant to instant the law of octaves works. An oversimplification of the law of octaves basically says that your threefold flame is absolute ruler of itself in whatever world that threefold flame is expressing. And in each octave, the threefold flame operating in that octave and the bodies that operate through that threefold flame are absolute ironclad rulers of their own consciousness. And there may not be any intrusion that is not first invited by the threefold flame. What this means is that from moment to moment, if your Holy Christ Self and your Mighty I Am Presence or the Ascended Masters are going to be in your world, it has to be because from moment to moment, you, in this octave, are making the invitation for that to be true. You are consciously, with premeditation, holding open the doorway to your Holy Christ Self to blend with your consciousness, to the Ascended Masters, to blend with your consciousness. And from moment to moment, as your attention flits about from place to place, as your feelings and so forth, whatever is going on there, as you shift, that law shifts just as swiftly as the blink of an eye. And so maybe you have not realized that such an impersonal principle is at work, and that while there is always the great overshadowing, brooding love of God that is waiting to come in, that it's not going to intrude itself unless joyfully welcomed. So this is part of the illumination that must come to you to understand that the first impulse must originate from this world, and you have to send it forth to your Holy Christ Self and to the Ascended Masters before they can respond. You'll find this referenced a number of places in the teachings. One of the places is in the instruction given by Lady Master Lito to the children in the latter part of the Magic Presence, where she points out that the great light of the God Presence will not intrude into the life of the individual unless it is joyfully invited to come in. And that is absolutely the case. In other places, Saint Germain has said unequivocally that even your own mighty I Am Presence will not intrude unless it is willingly and joyfully invited to enter into your world. So in this world, it is up to each one to open the doorway into those inner realms. Now you might say to me, well, if that's the case, then it's all really my doing. And is that really legitimate? Is it my own imagination that is producing something? Remember that from within your threefold flame, it is your mighty I Am Presence that is speaking. It is your Christ Self that is speaking constantly from within that flame. And when finally the promptings of the heart, which may begin as a very still, small voice, but when those promptings are acted on, and when the heart yearns for freedom and yearns for this expansion of consciousness and sends forth that magnetic heart call, that is the action of the presence that is working and is initiating from within the heart, from within out, and then, of course, compelling the answer to come forth from the octaves of light. So, now we understand this law of octaves. I could give you a number of examples. Maybe I'll just punctuate it with a couple of examples just so you can understand how uncanny this law is. The first example I draw from the history of the Ascended Master's work with the Theosophical Society. Many of you may know that Helena Blavatsky began her formal work with the Theosophical Society in New York City, and the first major treatise was entitled Isis Unveiled. In that work, there is actually a statement somewhere tucked in the many hundreds of pages, a statement to the effect that everyone only has one embodiment in the earth, and there is no provision made for reincarnation. Now, think about the fact that El Moria and the various masters have been visiting HPB in their finer bodies, doing all kinds of outer precipitations in her world, all kinds of miracles taking place in New York. And yet, because HPB had in her own mind this wrinkle of incorrect understanding, and because her mind force, whenever that subject came up, her mind force would lock on to its preconception. Because of the law of octaves, the masters were not permitted to override her mindset. What they did do, aware of the problems that this would provide, if that misteaching was to be popularized, what they did do is to insist that she move her headquarters and her operation over to India. And so they brought Olcott and HPB over to India. And although it's not in all of the literature, it is there in certain of the literature that within days of her arrival, El Morya came to HPB in his own physical body, so that he was in the same realm as she was, and instructed her that she had made this error in the writings and that she must set about correcting it immediately. That is an example of this particular principle. That's why the teachings that you accept are so critical, why superstition, religious superstition, is such a pernicious evil. Because if you do have such deep-seated, well-grounded ideas in your own psyche, and you haven't relinquished them or unlearned them, and you thrust that energy out, no one from the ascended octave or even your own God presence outwardly is going to come along and override the thrust of your consciousness until you yourself from within unlearn that error and put truth in its place. I could give many, many examples of this. We as messengers are extremely careful on certain aspects of the law that we suspend all opinion of our own on certain issues. And we make sure that there is absolute quiescence in our consciousness, that we have no emotional attachment or preconceived investment in any one particular principle or teaching that's been inherited from before, and that we take that issue to the Ascended Masters as a clean white page, totally receptive to what they wish to write upon that page. And we're very careful about that in many, many regards. And if ever there have been some things that have been carried over as misconceptions from one activity to another, many of them are attributed to this principle that they were just adopted of the whole cloth without that kind of examination and meticulous care. So, do you understand that in the relation to your own Holy Christ Self, then, it's your job to keep the doorway between worlds open and to keep a part of your attunement constant? How is this done? First of all, understand that it takes a degree of the surplus light of your crystal cord in your mind, in your mental body, in your emotional body, and yes, even in your physical body, in order for you to hold conscious attunement with your Holy Christ Self requires expending the spiritual energy of life. Just like anything else, attunement is not coasting along on a surfboard. Attunement with the Holy Christ Self requires drawing upon the reserves of the life force that your presence has deposited in the four lower bodies and focusing your attention upon your Christ Self and inviting the overshadowing by your Christ Self into your world. When that invitation is made and you have developed a momentum of doing this, then is the time for you to be able to do more than one thing at a time. Some of you, like me, who were around during the time when Mark was here, may recall in the kitchen at La Tourelle, he'd stop the guys as they were going from one job to another. He'd stop them there in the kitchen and make them pat their head and move their hand on their tummy and doing 2 or 3 things all at the same time. And that was a challenge, to try to do dissimilar acts all at the same time. The process of walking this path means that you have enough energy in your crystal cord so that at inner levels there is literally a thread of conscious contact, a conscious flow that is between your heart and the world of your own Holy Christ Self. And while you are doing other things out here with your body, while you're engaged in other activities, not 100% of your conscious attention is expended on those other things. And there's a part of your conscious awareness that is still holding open the door to your Holy Christ Self. And you are aware that your Holy Christ Self is there, and you are in. This is the state that has been used so many, many times to describe Beloved Mother Mary's attainment. It is the attunement of listening grace. It is the poised attunement of the mind, which has been the strings of the mind, like the strings of a violin, have been maintained at a certain tautness that is able to resonate to the mind of the Holy Christ Self, the heart of the Holy Christ Self. So that while you are doing other activities, part of your conscious awareness is holding that attunement and connection with the Holy Christ Self. It isn't always necessary by any means that specific thoughts or specific feelings be flowing along the shuttle of that attention. But there should be the sense of the open channel of two-way flow of the life essences between your world and the world of your Holy Christ Self. As you walk in that grace, that is the poise, Ascended Master poise, that is spoken of. It's when imperceptibly, even your posture takes on a certain natural rhythm, a certain gracefulness, a certain unspeakable dignity, all of which is just being osmosed into your outer persona because it is the very nature of your Holy Christ Self. So you and your Christ Self are reuniting outwardly, even as you have always been one inwardly. The twain are not really separate. They really are one and the same. And in fact, the greatest proof of that is the very fact that it has been the I Am Presence and the Holy Christ Self who have been insisting on all of these onerous and burdensome incarnations that we take over and over. Oh yes, I know, I've heard it said that it's all due to bad karma that keeps pulling us back into embodiment. But bad karma or no bad karma, even if there wasn't any bad karma, if the ascension had not taken place, the I Am Presence is going to incarnate to gain the mastery so that it can ascend. So it really is this higher self, this blessed God consciousness of the Holy Christ Self, that elects to descend and is there and knows itself to be there in the heart of the threefold flame. Initially, this thread of this open contact may be as fine as a filigree web, gossamer web that a spider might weave. But as you hold that doorway open and keep it building, it will grow. It will become a cable. There will be more of a downpouring and outpouring in your consciousness. This is so very, very important because you will begin to share life, the life that your presence lives. And then the path will no longer be a matter of willpower or of what one ought to do. It won't any longer be a matter of gritting your teeth and holding on by your fingernails and resolving that you're going to do it whether you feel like it or not, whether you understand it or not. Rather, you will be living. You will be living already before the ascension with one part of your world, one part of yourself already spanning into that next realm. And the beauty of that is that you will get reinforcement. I don't quite know how to try to explain that, but you'll get feedback and reinforcement and fulfillment out of the life that you are leading. It will be who you are and what you want to become, and just all of these other things, all of the things we were talking about this afternoon that seem so weighty when you're battling them from the outer standpoint, those things will just kind of fall away of their own dead weight into the violet flame and be replaced by this presence of your Holy Christ Self. More and more that will take place. What we have not understood before the great work of Saint Germain is the kind of things that have ignorantly repelled the aura of our Holy Christ Self, the kind of things that were in violation of this law of octaves. The list of those types of activities goes on and on. But as we've been saying, the Christ Self, nor the presence, nor the masters are going to interfere or intrude or force their way into our life. And so once we know our role, the part that we are to play, then things begin to clear up rather quickly. Then you actually get to the point of understanding that you and your Holy Christ Self are really in the business of this life together. It's like the two of you are in a rowboat, a leaky rowboat, and you both have to bail because what's good for one is good for the other. And your God presence and you have the same vested interest in your victory, because your victory is the victory of your Christ Self and your presence, and vice versa. So there is more and more this sense not of duality, not of separation, certainly not a sense that you are a creature, soul that has been created, that is waiting until some future time when it can marry the Christ, but rather that you are already this Christ Self, and that this is a higher part of yourself that more and more is coming to the fore. The Ascended Masters look to that Christ presence of each one when they look for cooperation and assistance in this world. They know that it is to the Christ that they must repair, and so must every one of us. One example I might give you is that you learn to practice this art of listening grace during all of your waking hours to some degree. And watch your mind. Sometimes the mind is like a trap that slams open and slams shut. For example, what happens when a session here comes to a close? When for an hour or two or three, we have been in the unbroken outpouring of the Ascended Master's consciousness. When that is over, the final benediction has been pronounced, and you are exiting the room and you move to the outer area, does a part of your conscious awareness remain tethered to the experience that you have just enjoyed? Or is there a tendency that the mind turns a key and all of a sudden an entirely different mode takes over and you're back to the old outer self that is just entirely fixated on outer things? The more mature Christ approach is to go ahead with those outer activities, but always there is this open, tethered consciousness that right back here somewhere is where this part of your consciousness holds this consciousness of the doorway open to the realm of the Christ Self and of the I Am presence, so that all of your activities constantly, there is a degree of that interaction with your Holy Christ Self that goes on and on. It's not by mistake that it was described in the case of Mother Mary as listening grace. Listening grace. So a part of the memory body, which is the highest in frequency of the four lower bodies, and even a part of the actual mind, the outer mind itself, a part of that is allocated to fashioning itself into an upraised chalice that is always elevated in expectancy for receiving the impulse that will be sent forth from the divine mind of the Holy Christ Self or of the Ascended Masters. And if a part of you is listening and waiting and receiving over that flow back and forth, then you will build upon that. But if you haven't cultivated that technique and you're either in the sanctuary decreeing or else you're off, shot from guns into whatever you're doing in the outer world, and that realm is sealed off for a matter of many, many hours or days in between decreeing sessions, and then you come back to it, don't be surprised if your path is moving forward by fits and starts, where it's 2 steps forward and 1.5 back, or you're just kind of going with a rocky motion, whereas it's possible to hold that attunement more and more open, beginning with the identification that you have with your Holy Christ Self as your own nature. One of the keys to all of this is that there has to be enough light in the four lower bodies of this life force that has been preserved so that you are able to hold that connection open. If there is a deficiency in that amount of light, your mental body won't be able to expend that amount of energy to keep that thread of contact alive. As that thread is alive, that whole world, that whole dimension of the realm of the Christ, which is a realm that is brimming over this Buddhic world, is the world where the web of life is constantly shuttling back and forth. The energies from Helios and Vesta, from the sun behind the sun, the electronic rivers of life that are pouring forth from the sun behind the sun, bathing this entire planet at the level of the Buddhic world of the Christ Selves. Then you have that energy passing through the earth to the sun of even pressure and coming back from the sun of even pressure, interacting along the way in countless ways with that electronic, meeting, magnetic, and so forth. This is a world of vitality, of life, of a superabundance, of consciousness. It's a world where there is so much interconnectedness of consciousness that even while each one's Holy Christ Self has a focus and a seat of its own consciousness, each Holy Christ Self, because it is possessed of the mind of God, capable of processing infinite thoughts and sensations simultaneously, each Holy Christ Self is also simultaneously omnipresent throughout that entire web of life, and aware of itself in all other parts of life, aware wherever there's a threefold flame, aware of this life coursing through the mineral life, coursing through the elementals, through the plants, through the rest of humanity as well. All of that is part of the consciousness of your own individual Holy Christ Self. So as you begin to hold that connection open, don't feel that unless there's an actual sentence that falls down and hits you on the head like a brick, that you haven't got communion with your Holy Christ Self. There is transference of radiation, transference of spirit, transference of this élan, this joy of life, this expansiveness of being, this sense. Saint Germain put it so magnificently years ago. Breathes there a man whose soul so dead, who to himself hath not said, "This is my own, my native universe." That is the Buddhic consciousness that will be transferred more and more to you as you hold attunement, conscious connection with your own Holy Christ Self, to where you will feel like you belong to this great macrocosmic universe, and this great macrocosmic universe belongs to you. That there is this ebb and flow back and forth, and the greatest truth of all is the oneness that includes it all. And once you start to experience that life that is there, the compelling draw to be in that presence, to be in that radiation, to hold that connection open, the fulfillment of it, the reinforcement of it, the conviction that no one could ever take from you, you will have a very stark black and white contrast if that ever absents itself from your world. And you'll be able to connect cause and effect instantly as to what it was that happened that caused this whole other realm to close shut and to seal you out of that other realm. And you'll quickly know how to reestablish the shuttle of that flow of life back and forth between you and that world. As more and more individuals are vested, as we are seeking to do, as the Ascended Masters are seeking to do within this activity, the Temple of the Presence, we are seeking to empower every one of you to don that garment of your own Holy Christ Self right here, right now, in its fullness. Not feel you have to wait to evolve, to gain greater attainment than you have, or some future initiation, but to know that that is accessible to you now. And as more and more individuals awaken to that realm, to where their own Holy Christ Self is more and more at the helm of the controls of the heart flame and of the four lower bodies, as that happens, first in individuals here and there, and then scores and hundreds and thousands, and that builds, that collectively is the image of a golden age. That's what we are working for as a golden age. And that truly is the wonderful, wonderful life that awaits every one of you to enter into that consciousness. I know that as you begin to quaff that liquid light of that Christ consciousness, that you will never again be satisfied with any lesser life experience than the great life wave of your own God consciousness. Thank you.